Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of Voyager Quarter videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another Roll20 review, my written and video review series where we take a look at the marketplace section of online role-playing website Roll20.net. This video will be reviewing the D&D 5e Anthology book Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, published by Wizards of the Coast and adapted by Roll20. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. So, Journeys to the Radiant Citadel is like Candlekeep Mysteries before it, and includes over a dozen mini, adventures that technically take place all in their own unique settings, inspired by real-world cultures. So this the big promotion for this book was that it was created by a bunch of non-white creators, BIPOC, and not only that, so we get it behind the camera, but also in front of the camera, because all of the characters are a lot of black and brown and Asian characters, and we don't get that very much in a lot of the default fantasy settings, I'll say, that tend to be based on the European medieval model, which for whatever reason people assumed was mostly white. So it's refreshing, but I think what we want to really look at is, are these adventures any good? What does that actually mean? And the nice thing is, you don't have to actually have these take place in the Radiant Citadel. So the Radiant Citadel itself is a magic hub world, and kind of like Sigil, where there has different portals to all these different cultures, and then you can have these adventures take place in all these different unique settings and worlds. And I think maybe part of the worry, at least that I had going into it, was like, well, what if I don't want to set my whole campaign in one of these worlds just to run this one adventure? You don't have to do that at all. In fact, there's adventure details and notes that tell you, hey, if you want to run this with the Radiant Citadel and be able to teleport to those specific areas, you totally can. Or you can place these in the Forgotten Realms. You can place these in Eberron. One of them you could even place in like Ravenloft. It kind of, or Dragonlance. Like, it gives you some ideas and hints and tips on where to set these things, because it could just be a regional thing. It doesn't have to be its own like unique world space. It could just be, hey, this is a part of the Forgotten Realms. It just happens to be in this area that maybe you haven't really adventured in, and that's why you get this really strong, unique cultural flavoring. So from that aspect, I think it does a really good job. At the very start, before I go into detail too much, I will say I think it's a very well done anthology book. I think the comparison to Candlekeep Mysteries is pretty apt. If you enjoyed Candlekeep Mysteries' format, where it was a lot of not connected but still fairly easily drop-inable, those size adventures, and I think you're going to like those here. I think that the tendency for these adventures is that they maybe lean more towards exploration and role-playing versus straight-up dungeon crawling, even though we do have battle maps for every single adventure. I just think the overall, I would say, I had to go back and look at the Candlekeep Mysteries one, but a lot of those were definitely very dungeon crawling heavy, even if the dungeon crawl happened to be like a mansion or something, But in terms of these, it's a lot of maybe you're exploring around a city and you're investigating things, or you're dealing with factions or something, and maybe a little bit more RP and social and political drama heavy. But that's not to say there are some really great dungeon crawl adventures as well. There are also slightly fewer adventures here. I believe Candlekeep included 17 adventures, and this one includes 13. But I still think the overall content is really good, and some of the adventures are quite long, especially the last one in here is really crazy cool, and probably one of the most badass adventures I've ever looked at. In fact, I'm going to give a full deeper dive in each of the adventures in a separate video where I rank all the adventures, similar to how I did with Candlekeep Mysteries. So look out for that video as well. But here I'm going to be doing kind of an overall review process for Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, which will look at the Roll20 adaptation, as well as, because it's a new product, I'm going to give my overall thoughts and feelings towards basically if you should care about this product or not. So what do you get if you purchase Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel on the Roll20 bundle? You get a full module that includes all 13 mini adventures. You also get the ability to add on each individual adventure to your module. And the reason that's important is because very rarely is anybody going to want to run all 13 of these as part of a campaign. You could technically do that, but there's no through line, there's no interconnected story. You definitely have to run the Radiant Citadel thing so that you can explain why people are teleporting to all these vastly different cultures in the span of very little time. And more than likely, you're going to pick and choose your favorites. So in that case, you can just go under your Roll20 module, go to the game add-on drop-down menu, and just select the ones that you want, and then it just adds them. Basically just like one of these little sections that are already in their own little drop-down menu. And I think the organization here is really, really good. These anthologies tend to just lend themselves really well to Roll20, where it shows up with just the most pertinent information. There's just enough kind of different headings where you can find out what you need without there being just 1,000 in there, so you're not having to scroll through a bunch of information. So I think presentation-wise, it does a very, very good job, and Candlekeep as well, of keeping everything organized and usable to the max for the DM. It includes 13 of those adventures, which range from level 1 to 14. The level 1 adventure includes a level up halfway through, because we all know level 1 sucks. 20 grid maps, which is a pretty good amount. That equates to 5 10-foot battle maps, which are subdivided into 5-foot squares, because you need 5-foot squares for D&D 5e, and 15 5-foot battle maps. We also get 13 non-gridded regional maps, which means they're literally maps of, an overland map, for example, which I think do have the mile marker that you can use the compass tool on in Roll20, but obviously there's no grid there, and you're not designed to actually have your tokens on that map. But 13, guess what? That equates to 1 regional map for each one of these regions. Now, some of these adventures use their region better than others, and it's interesting because you can almost look at the tiers of play, because this takes place from tier 1 to tier 3, and when you're a lower level, you're really not at a situation where you're going out over the whole land adventuring. You're usually like in one town doing one thing. So it tends to be the higher level adventurers tend to use their region a little better. You're actually like adventuring across the land, versus the lower level ones, and maybe you actually barely see any of the region, but you get a good slice of it, usually based on the major town that it takes place in. It also includes over 120 monster sheets with over 50 named NPCs, all of which have stat blocks, token art, and handouts. There are about, I think about a dozen completely new monsters that are unique to Journeys to the Radiant Citadel, which again equals to about 1 new monster per adventure, usually one kind of cool signature monster. This is one of them that's on the cover of, I believe it's actually one of my least favorite adventures, which is the lowest level one, Salted Legacy. And there's some really cool ones, though. There's some really, really neat creatures. Some of them some of the adventures are specifically based around that creature, and others, they just kind of have an excuse to use such a thing. Also includes over 30 player art handouts, which does not include all the monster and NPC handouts. So that's just like art like this, basically, where it's like environmental art or showcasing a scene or something. Really, really gorgeous art, by the way. Wizards has gotten they've got Magic the Gathering. So they've always been really good at commissioning great art and artists, and I've been floored by just how good they do of painting the picture of all these unique characters and settings and cultures. It's gorgeous. Over 50 magic item handouts and journal notes on the Radiant Citadel's brief history, politics, and notable locations. So first, we're going to get into one of my biggest cons of this book, which, and I'm making that Candlekeep Mysteries comparison a lot, because this is really very similar to that. If anything, it's kind of a combination of Candlekeep Mysteries and Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, because Van Richten's was very much here's a series of world-building notes. I believe it only had like the one actual adventure, but here's a series of how to have adventures in all these different domains, whereas Candlekeep was like, here's all these different adventures. This one includes all the different adventures, but then includes a gazetteer, which is becoming a more popular way of saying, hey, this is our like source world building note section for every single one of these adventures. So they include all of these notes about the history and the culture and the factions and notable locations, and here's a picture of them, and they all have different maps and stuff. So basically how to have adventures in these areas, different names, literally all of them have a D4 table. Every single one of these adventures as a D4 table for different adventure hooks, and like what your character's like if they're from that area. That's all very, very cool. I was going to start with the con. The con is that the Radiant Citadel itself, I think, is kind of the weakest part of this whole thing, unlike Candlekeep Mysteries, where I thought Candlekeep was a very cool setting, and it has the advantage of having been storied in Forgotten Realms history. Had a really gorgeous isometric map that I recall that was just absolutely jaw-droppingly amazing and looked great in Roll20. It was just a huge facility with all this different, history and great things going on. And several of the adventures actually took place in Candlekeep Mysteries. Several of those adventures took place in the Candlekeep, whereas others, they began there and then took you elsewhere, or they were just you found a book somewhere because the book thing was the thing that tied them together. Here, I just don't really get anything interesting or exciting about this area. It's kind of a socialist utopia, which is fine. Like everybody, there's universal basic income and everybody takes care of each other. And it's kind of a paradise, which is boring. I mean, it's a great place to live. Don't get me wrong. Like fucking sign me up. But the reason people like to adventure in cyberpunk cities or fascist regimes or war-torn empires is because the drama is there. Like there's always cool shit happening. I mean, it's all, pretty dark and dramatic stuff, but that makes for compelling storytelling. Whereas here, this is kind of just a nice rest hub. There's really no good adventure ideas going on, and there's not a lot of drama going on. The biggest drama is that this whole it's a giant planar. I mean, it's like utopian New York City. It's a whole bunch of different cultures coming together. There's a giant crystal that's stabbed through the middle of it that kind of is your main energy source for everything. And then it's got all these, kind of like Sigil, where it's got all these doors and portals to all these different cultures. And then there's some that are still missing that haven't been alighted. There's these incarnate spirit animals that work for every culture. And then they know that they're still missing a dozen of them or something. So that's the big overarching stories. We're trying to find all these things, but that doesn't really play into the there is no campaign or anything like that. It's just that's the background for the Radiant Citadel. So I just didn't think that the Citadel itself was very interesting or had a lot of things going on about it. It just felt like it was just kind of there as a hub world and really as a place for you to chat and level up. It almost reminded me of kind of playing an old MMO or something where everybody returns to the town and there's the bazaar going on, and it's not a place for an adventure hub. It's just a social lounge to hang out. So I think as a D&D thing, it's just a little boring to me, especially when compared to Candlekeep, where I think Candlekeep was actually very, very interesting. But the actual and even though that's obviously a part of the book and technically on the cover of the book, I think this is the least impactful part of the book. So to have that be a con is honestly not a deal breaker at all for me, because the actual adventures, that's what matters. That's what you should care about. And I think the adventures are very good. Again, to do a deep dive of the adventures, you're going to want to look at my ranking video. But overall, and I've spent all week looking at the adventures and really analyzing and reading through all of them, three-fourths of them I would give a super thumbs up to. Just honestly very, very well done, well designed, cool ideas. Even if some of them are not necessarily my cup of tea that I wouldn't necessarily want to run, which means they're more leaning towards dealing with factions and dealing with the politics of a city and investigating things and not doing what I like to do is good old-fashioned dungeon crawling, but with a lot of cool story and stuff involved with that too. And there is some of that as well. Just to give you a brief idea, we've got volcanic jungles, swampy riverlands, imperial cities, floating sky bridges, underwater cities, and the husk of an insectoid alien god floating in void space. Just to name a couple of the settings that are used here. So, and yes, a lot of them are, there's clearly ones that are based on, Asian cultures and African cultures and South American cultures. And you can make those even immediate through, this is specifically Korean culture. You can make those specific parallels. But on top of that, it's still D&D. It's still fantasy. There's still fantasy-ass races going around. There's still, creatures and monsters and just a lot of cool things layered on top of having an interesting, unique cultural setting that is honestly used pretty well. Yes, it's a backdrop in all of these settings, but honestly, they do a really great job of incorporating that into the adventures, whether you're having to have a Mardi Gras type parade, and you're having to work your way through that, or just different. You're searching through the buried it's clearly a Chinese inspired. It's a dynasty thing that's underneath this imperial city, and going through the king, the queen of old, and it just does a cool job of layering all these really. God, the one that I love is the the one that it's a coastal city, and they never use the word slave or slavery, which I think is pretty apt, but they mention the fact that they were raided and people were kidnapped, and the kidnapped people jumped off boats, and then those people had a lot of magic, so they ended up going down into the underwater ocean and building this underwater like Atlantis city under the ocean. Now that's like a sister city, and there's a whole the adventure, of course, involves having to go down there and retrieve and explore like this ghostly shipwreck and everything. And it's such a cool way of incorporating and some do it better than others, but I think they all do a really great job of actually incorporating the important cultural and history while also having cool D&D adventures. It really is pretty impressive. Let's look at an example of some of these adventures, probably some of my favorite ones. And I'm going to show you what the maps look like. So DM's tips page is something that Roll20 has been including a lot. Kind of tells you how to look from the tokens viewpoint, how to work the macros, which are all included in here. Rollable tables, what to find in the journal. If you're new at Roll20, these are very useful to have. They've started incorporating these in pretty much all of their products for the most part. We've seen the Radiant Citadel one. Let's look at... okay, so this is... Which one is this? This is Written in Blood, which is... This one could be a fucking Jordan Peele. It's like Southern Gothic horror. It's so good. That starts out with like a bunch of people like possessed, and you can see this really great artwork. And you know what's good about this art? I don't know if Roll20, if Wizards did this, or if Roll20 had the initiative to do this, but every single one of the named NPCs ends up, well, not every, like maybe like 3 that aren't, that have unique token art. And they take a lot of the token art from these kind of pictures where it's handouts that aren't necessarily of specific creatures, but and I don't know if Roll20 is doing this or not, but they'll crop some of these pictures and make those the artwork for like creatures or for NPCs. So you end up having pretty much token art for all of these named NPCs, which works really well because nothing is worse than having a bunch of creatures and monsters that just have like the words written on them, which I don't think there's too many examples of that. Trying to flip through right here that I can see. I mean, these are all from the monster manual, so there's very few. Let's go to the named NPC. So yeah, you can see as I scroll through here, just about every one of these has interesting, and then not only with their character sheets, but you've got separate handouts that you can click on to actually bring them up. So like this one is straight up cropped from a bigger picture. You've probably seen it with the like dancers with they've got their high heeled shoes as weapons because they're also it's kind of a similar idea where it's people being possessed and controlled. In this case, it's a poison and not a nasty like curse thing happening. But I thought that was a really cool factor, is that we actually have really great character, not only great art handouts, but great character portraits for all of these as well. All right, so this one is an example of the maps. Now, I know what you're going to say immediately, and I've already said it. Damn, we don't have good map art. Well, we have kind of good map art. In fact, the map art is by Mike Schley and Sean McDonald, which did a lot of the map art that I love from like Prince of the Apocalypse and everything. We just don't have color, which looks, unfortunately, very not great on Roll20, which is a huge bummer, and that's the case for all these maps. That was also the case for Candlekeep Mysteries' maps as well. So for that, it's kind of a pass in terms of how to compare those two. It is hugely disappointing. I don't know why Wizards skimps on this, because we've had a lot of adventures with a lot of map art before. Rime of the Frostbane, Tomb of Annihilation. I mentioned Prince of the Apocalypse. Like all of those have great map art with color, and then others don't. A lot of recent ones don't. And Candlekeep Mysteries was one of those. So it's a bummer. It doesn't look good on virtual tabletops. So that's another big con. Although I will say that the map art itself can honestly look pretty good. You can see like the detail on this one. Like this looks like a map that you would see, in my Tomb of Annihilation campaign or in my Realm of the Frostbane campaign, with those full detailed, they're not the little hashes or whatever. It looks like there's textured grass and everything. It looks really, really good. Just why didn't you give me some art for that? Or not art. Why didn't you give me some color for that? Because that would have looked a lot better. But all of the dynamic lighting is in place. I'd have to make one of these characters have vision so you can be able to see it, but I will give you an example. Give you vision, and let's make sure that you can see. All right, so there's the dynamic lighting, and you can see as you move around, that's already in place. This is only if you are a Roll20 subscriber, by the way, that dynamic lighting functionality is going to work for you, but it is all baked in there regardless. You can see kind of an example of what the artwork looks like. This is literally this adventure. You're exploring rural farmlands, and a bunch of farmers are possessed. And it turns out it's kind of this nasty curse that involves a bunch of crawling claws that have of people that were buried. There's a whole past here, and then they all form together to form this really creepy monster thing called a soul shaker, which is just an undead creature with a bunch of grasping limbs, which is probably a certain phobia. Look at this thing. A grasping mass of humanoid limbs. Obsessive claimer of corpses and collector of body parts. Real gross and cool looking. Really neat adventure too, where it just gets more and more creepy as you go along. You get the house, and there's all these possessed farmers are sitting around not doing anything. Like, it's really, but they got the glowing eyes. But you can see how they cropped that one picture for the token art. I think that's really effective and works pretty well. This is a very small dungeon crawl and a pretty short adventure. Some of them have much longer dungeons, and I'll give you some examples. Oh, let's see. We just looked at Park of the Elders. Let's do the Gold Warren. That's from I think it's more Spanish inspired, maybe. It's from this empire built on gold mines, and it's got a really fun story with these two princes that are kind of dueling vying for the right to marry the current empress. And of course, one of them is actually behind the problems in this mine, has summoned a bunch of creatures which are like gold hunting, multi-legged, kind of like foxy looking creatures called, what are they called? Aramvarax. See, there's the hand, and these handouts are designed so you can click on this and then show to players. You can show them what they look like. But it's a pretty solid dungeon crawl, and I like the way that, and you can say this one's a little bit more meatier. This one incorporates a story really well, where you've got both princes that accompany you, and one of them is kind of not really the adventuring type, but maybe you can build him up to be, and the other one is supposed to be very heroic, but of course he's faking it because he knows he's designed these creatures to make himself look good and let himself be the hero. So there's an interesting bit of story that's baked into everything here. And this is one that you might not necessarily end up, traveling around the whole region or anything like that. You end up going to basically the one city. I think it all takes place in, I forget which. I think it's Anissa. Yeah, because there's the Gold Warren. So this one, you're really not going all of the Sensa Empire, for example. You're pretty much all just taking place in and around Anissa, and the Gold Warren is where the actual dungeon takes place. Other ones, you might be going across the entire area, like in... Is this the Riverlands one? Yeah, so this one, every river is inhabited by a river spirit called a Riverine. And there was one fourth one that is a mysterious past that disappeared, and then your adventure is you start off with this giant tidal wave crashing across. So I show you some of these. I think this one, Mists of Benarisha. There we go, the Storm of Destruction. Look at this art. Literally destroying as a huge flood appears to crash down on the kind of coronation of somebody winning these very important athletic games. And of course, it's just somebody who's been demonized, is very jealous of that person, kidnaps that person and the trophy, and you have to chase after them and basically go on a river outdoor adventure where it's a whole bunch of kind of random encounters as you venture across the land, guided by a secret were-tiger, and end up traveling a pretty good distance across this entire area until you finally, look at this art. Oh my gosh, it's so good. Really brings you into the immersion of all these. It's really neat to look at a bunch of adventures where they all take place in such different regions of, and not just culture, but physical geography. The only one I feel like we're really missing is there's no snowy region that I can recall. It's a lot of arid regions. It's a lot of tropical regions. There's one that's volcanic. Ooh, let's see if I can show you that one. This one that's a swampland is really cool. There's ones that are very there's one that takes place in floating archipelagos with a sky bridge. I think that's the Korean one that twists between different places. And you have to help. That one is a cool boss fight at the end. I think I can show you that map. That's the, what is that called? They're just all running together now. Roots of Bathalong. There we go. So this is another unique creature, which is a dragon that is currently going to fight you unless you can defeat these spirit blisters. Again, a really cool map that you can see that really could have benefited from art. There's a cool scene where this one ends up with a bunch of dragon hunters that obviously it matters a big deal whether how you've interacted with them in the course of the adventure. Up until now, you could have even defeated them before now, or you could help them defeat the dragon. You could say, hey, don't defeat the dragon. This dragon's actually a cool, like, sacred part of these people, but it's being corrupted by this evil tree thing that we need to actually destroy, and ends up being a really interesting boss battle, I think, at the end of this one. Probably one of my favorite adventures. Which one was the volcano one? Let me check my notes. It was the Trail of Destruction, which was the Gate of Illumination. This was like the Aztec one. There we go. Very cool map. This one you also end up going across like half of this setting. There's a bunch of, this one has a really cool mix of outdoor adventure but also dungeon crawling, and including going up this observatory that actually crashes down because it's like earthquakes hitting it. And this one has a very cool final boss monster. I don't know if I should try to pronounce it or not, but it's like an axolotl, but like telexolotl. I went for it. And thankfully there is a pronunciation guide for every single name in here. In fact, every single adventure has their own pronunciation guide. Look at this. So cool. And of course, yeah, the freaking like elemental fire giant lizard thing is going to have like salamanders and fire snakes raiding everybody. And it's a whole big like ecological disaster that's hitting them. Very, very cool. I just think each adventure is very well organized. I mentioned that before, but it really bears repeating. Like, I had no problem going through and getting all the information. I mean, it helps that they're all decently shorter adventures, but the way it breaks up, the dungeon crawl is just one, area here, and then the actual like going from point A to point B and then point B to point C are all different headings. And then you also have the Gazetteers also separate, which is just background information for that individual region, and gives information on, how to expand upon it if you wanted to have different adventures, your players want to explore around, but you don't have. I think there's, honestly, each one of these does a really good job, with maybe some exception to some of the earlier ones, of showcasing you what the full region looks like, what their culture is like, and gives you a good kind of sampler of it without necessarily having to do some expanded adventuring job. So overall, I think it's a huge thumbs up. I was pretty impressed with everything I saw here, with the disappointment being basically just the lack of color in all of these maps, including the region maps, which is a bummer, because some of these region maps you'll be using a lot of. And what I do is I put the token directly on the map to represent the party as they're traveling across, and as well as the battle maps, which is a bummer. But and then the Radiant Citadel itself being just not very interesting. There is a section at the end called Beyond the Radiant Citadel, which the only thing I can discover here is it has 2 notes. It has 2 more Gazetteers, basically, of 2 more settings. I just don't know if these didn't get used and they were supposed to be used, or if they just decided to throw some extra ones in here that like you could use. But there are no maps or adventures for these settings. There's just like the Gazetteer information for them, and we only get 2 of them here. So I guess it's kind of just a bonus thing that's fine, but I wouldn't necessarily look for anything. Like maybe some third-party folks, from the DM's Guild or something, can help expand on some of these. But boy, the bar has really been raised when it comes to these anthology adventures, because I think Candlekeep was really, really solid. A good way of showing off a lot of the Forgotten Realms stuff, and especially Candlekeep. And I think this one is really solid without showcasing any specific one fantasy world. But very importantly, I should show you an example of how it does that. It does tell you, hey, if you don't want to hear, okay, here's the pronunciation guide. Some of these have a hilarious number of NPCs. Here we go. So for examples, for this one, obviously you can all have them take place in the Radiant Citadel, because the Radiant Citadel, like Sigil, has a teleporter. I think you teleport via crystals to every one of these places. So if you want to use Radiant Citadel, you can, but you don't have to. You can set it in the Forgotten Realms. It says, hey, it could sprawl along the peaks of Flame and Chult, or the Fire Steep Mountains east of the Lake of Steam. You can pull out those maps, I guess. Or in Greyhawk, or some of them mention, again, Ravenloft or Eberron or Dragonlance. Like, you can put these in your current campaign setting, and it could just be, hey, this is this region's, culture and flavor and stuff, and here's just a fun, different, perhaps more exotic, area for your players to adventure in. And I think it does a really cool job of making that exoticism interesting, informative, but most importantly, still have a really fun, great D&D adventure with very few exceptions that maybe lean a little bit more towards the role-playing side versus the adventuring and dungeon crawling side. But I think there is going to be enough for everybody to enjoy here, especially, gosh, the final two. Honestly, I like the final pretty much. What's interesting is I think as you get higher level, I think my enjoyment increases. So maybe that's an example of how the higher level ones tend to use their region more and just have more content overall versus the lower level ones, although there are some good ones in those lower levels. I mentioned Written in Blood, and is really good. That's the one that feels like a Jordan Peele horror one. And then Fiend of Hollow Mine might actually be my favorite one just because it's got a really great dungeon crawl. But gosh, the end ones are so, I mean, don't sleep on Orchids of the Invisible Mountain. The name is kind of sounds like almost sounds like a great American novel or something, but the adventure is the one that includes the adventure through the insectoid god carcass floating in void space at the end, and going through the Feywild and having this gauntlet of crazy creatures left and right. Like it's an amazing adventure. So there's a lot to really enjoy here. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel. Pros: 13 mini adventures infused with a wide range of themes, cultures, and settings. You're pretty much not going to find a bigger variety of settings here. And I think that's kind of what I usually say about anthologies, is they do have that good variety of content. I will say that, and not as a pro or a con, as I mentioned before, it bears repeating, that these ones tend to lean a little bit more towards political drama. And I don't mean politics like has been thrown around a lot in modern times. What I mean political in terms of you are literally dealing with factions of people versus like a single entity and then like a single dungeon crawl or a single monster, where there might be, disputes, and it might not even be nobility. It could just be, the Hatfield and McCoy situation where like two rural families are at it. That's kind of what I mean by political drama. Or it means like you're having to deal with like the full force of a city. For example, there's a whole one of the adventures. It's a city run by a celestial, and it's kind of a utopian city, but it's also very rigid and strict and extremely lawful. And there's a faction that very much supports this and a faction that opposes this non-violently, and then there's all these other factions. And the direct plot line is actually end up working for one of the two factions, and that determines like literally which creatures you end up battling during this kind of prison break sequence at the end of this mini adventure. And a lot of them involve, and several of them involve like choices between two different factions as you go along. Others, it's just kind of incorporated into the actual backstory of the plot. But there's a lot of faction dealing with, which I think works for the most part, but just know ahead of time, if your players aren't interested in engaging with a lot of that stuff, you might not get as much out of this one compared to other adventures. Pro: each adventure features a unique region inspired by real-world cultures and a gazetteer for world building and further adventuring. It honestly does a really great job of specifically, I would say, African, Asian, and South American cultures, settings, not just the names and the artwork and dress, but really digging into like the mythologies and maybe what creatures would be more apt there, and the kind of stories that you would see unfold, but still making it fantasy. Like, yes, you can see the through lines, some of them more clearly than others, but I was still very impressed by how well they incorporated that into still a fantasy, D&D like universe. Pro: regional map and at least one battle map for each adventure. Obviously, there'll be a con later when we get to the colorization, but the actual maps are there, the content is there, and the map art style is at least very, very good for the battle maps and the regional maps too. Pro: over 50 named NPCs with unique art and tokens. That's a really cool feature that I mentioned, where I think a lot of the player art handouts were strategically cropped to form those named NPC tokens, so that we actually end up with unique token art for a lot of the tokens. And a lot of these adventures include a lot of NPCs. Like, they really throw them at you by the bucketful. Sometimes, like, every single different plot beat, you get another NPC to join your party, or not. You can tell them to fuck off, but there's a ton of options for that. The one that probably does that the least, they give you a macaw, which is like semi-intelligent and can point you to different things, which I think is hilarious and awesome. And again, bonus, just super thumbs up to that. That's the last adventure, by the way, that the Orchids of the Invisible Mountain, really great adventure. And pro: character hooks, pronunciation guides, and adventure settings for bringing each adventure into other realms. That's very important for me, because I'm not looking at any of these worlds saying I want to run a whole campaign or series of adventures in necessarily any of these settings. But I do like these adventures that are written. So how do I drop some of those into current campaigns or run them in, you know, a series of one-shots that still takes place in the Forgotten Realms? Well, you can just have them travel to this other region, and then you just got it. You can use it straight from there and just, hey, this is the culture that you're dealing with, and here's your adventure. And I think that works really well and helps alleviate some of those fears about, and frankly, helps solve the problem of my other con, which is that the actual Radiant Citadel itself is just not that interesting to where I would probably skip using it. So cons, Radiant Citadel itself isn't a compelling adventure hub. It is not Candlekeep. It is a lovely little social lounge, but I didn't see anything compelling about it, nor any reason to really use it, other than maybe some kind of headquarters staging grounds for some, later level campaign where you need to use it as a portal to get around different places. Or maybe you do want to have just a nice headquartered area that isn't tied to any one fantasy world, then that would serve you fairly well. There's just nothing really going on there that would be very interesting. That's where all the adventures come in, I guess. Another con is that the maps lack color, except for the Radiant Citadel map, but that's a huge bummer. Wizards, come on, I know y'all are making money. Yeah. We get good map art. Like, what are you doing? Like, we can get some good colors here, and that would really, and shout out to people that, you know, do the maps, and it's not y'all's fault, but there are, like, for example, the map art here I think is way better than Candlekeep Mysteries' art, but it's just the fact that we're missing that colorization that really sucks. So hopefully folks are out there that can do that. It sucks to promote that because I want to be able to pay the artists to be able to do that themselves, but I wish Wizards did that work, and we had that, because for virtual tabletop it is really important. All right, final verdict, featuring an astonished variety of settings, cultures, themes, and genres. Journeys to the Radiant Citadel is an excellent anthology of short and not so short adventures that can be incorporated into any fantasy world. Thank you for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel, and support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. Shouts to platinum patrons: Joe, Will, Thomas, Adam, Stan, William, I'm Loud, Brandon, Genocider, David, Eclectic, Roleplay Roll, Christopher, Brian, William, and David. Gold patrons: RPG Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcus, Dead Lizard, Lounge, Sam, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Nathan, Fast Like a Tortoise, Scott, Humanoid, Sized, Sphincters, and Stephanie. Thank you all very much for your support.